Hey everyone, Card Cafe here with another deck profile, continuing the Fated Clash train, this time with one of my personal favorite decks, the Direful Doll deck. Not to be confused with the Nightmare Dolls over in Premium and V. For obvious reasons, I'm pretty sure they were too concerned about breaking Premium if they made more Nightmare Doll support, since that deck is already still really good. So, Direful Dolls it is, but this deck is really fun. It balances, that old school palemoon mechanic with some Gear Chronicle binding and guard mechanics that are new and interesting. I think this deck is just really cool and kind of divergent from a lot of the game design we've been seeing lately. So let's talk about what this does. First and foremost, with our ride line here. So grade 1, or the grade 0, as always, is, when rode upon going second, you draw a card. The important thing here is that it's a Direful Doll. With a lot of the skills and with this deck in general, what you're going to see is that the name Direful Doll matters. And that pretty much everything you see in here is going to be a Direful Doll with a couple of notable exceptions. And it's important to have that name for what these skills do. But otherwise, same start as all the other ones. Just Direful Doll in the name. That's the important part. The grade 1 says, when she is rode upon by Griselda, the grade 2, you search the top 7 cards of your deck for up to 2 Direful Dolls, put them into your soul, shuffle your deck. So right there, already starting off with a Direful Doll restriction of you looking specifically for Direful Dolls in the top 7, putting them into your soul to set up for later. And then the grade 2 says, when she's rode upon by a grade 3 with Direful Doll in their name, she pops out of the soul to rearguard. It's already getting a little bit of that palemoon mechanic of popping out of the soul when a certain condition is met. And then the grade 3, our main boy over here, Direful Doll Master Android, who is actually a human, not a Rookoid, because that matters for a lot of these skills, including his own. He's got 2 things going on. The first is an act, which is kind of +1. You choose up to the same number of Workoroid cards with Direful Doll in their name from your soul, equal to your opponent's Vanguard's grade. So if they're at grade 2, you get to choose 2. If they're at 3, you get to choose 3, so on and so forth. You call that many Direful Doll Workoroids to the board. If you call 3 or more, he gets +1 drive. So really good consistent skill where you're able to just fill your board for 1 counterblast, essentially what your opponent is on grade 3, and then he is also getting triple drive. It's the good kind of triple drive too, the +1 drive, not the text triple drive. So we like that as well. But that isn't all that he does. What makes this card really interesting is actually his second skill, which is when this unit is attacked, you get to choose up to 1 Workoroid card with Direful Doll in its name from your bind zone, call it to the Guardian Circle, and it gets 5,000 shield. Now, it's a really cool and interesting skill because we haven't really seen many defensive mechanics in the D series yet. And as you're going to see as we go along, most, if not all, of the Direful Dolls in this deck bind themselves due to some sort of effect, and you can then just call them back later to guard with, and they get at least plus 5,000 power shield from his effect before going to the drop zone. So really interesting skill. Like that he just builds a board for free and then has the utility to be able to guard. Makes this a very tanky deck, as I'm sure a lot of you have learned by now playing against this. It's really hard to kill this deck because of just how much they're able to build up in their bind zone and guard and just make it so they almost never have to both call from hand to fill their board or call from hand to guard. So they just build up a hand naturally because of that, making them even more tanky. So that's your ride line. Let's go over the rest of the grade 3. So we obviously are running max Persona ride copies. So there's 3 more of him. No Grail. I don't feel Grail is super effective in this deck. You already got a good number of non-shield cards and lower shield cards. So you want to be running as little, non-Direful Dolls as possible. So I feel 3 of this feels fine, especially because you just farm up a hand anyway. But let's talk about one of the most important cards of the decks. The first of the Holy Trinity, we'll call it, of the units in your deck, which is Direful Doll Liberata. 100% a 4 of. Now this card is very strong, and she has a couple of effects that we'll go over. So the first is when she's placed on rear guard or guardian circle, very important. If you have a Vanguard, grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Direful Doll in its name, you get to choose a card with Direful Doll in its card name from your drop and put it into Soul. So this is a really key piece just right there out of the gate as far as recycling your pieces. So if you remember, we're calling Direful Dolls that are in a bind zone to the Guardian Circle to guard, and then they're going to the drop zone because they're retired from the Guardian Circle. This is one of your ways of taking those units that you just guarded with and putting them back into your soul to use later, mainly for his effect to call them back out to the board. So very strong consistent skill right there, both on rear guard and guardian circle. Also not name restricted, so she can put copies of herself back, which is huge. We love that. But that's only the first thing that she does. The second is that when she attacks, so long as you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, your opponent does not have to be a grade 3, notably here. You can give her 10,000 power to the end of the turn, and then if you do, she binds herself. And you can counterblast 1 to draw a card. So this is the first instance of a Direful Doll just binding itself for its effect in order to put itself in the bind zone so that Android can call it from the bind zone to guard later. She's only a 5k shield because she's a grade 3, but he is giving her at least a 5k shield to be able to block those smaller attacks or at least assist bigger attacks by adding a 5k shield to it. And then if you have the spare counterblast, you can get a draw out of it as well to build up your hand even faster. So really all just an amazing card. 23k beater by herself, binding to guard later, putting things back from your drop zone into the soul, and drawing you a card. This is a 4 of, it's never not going to be a 4 of in this deck. It's too good. But then the next critical piece, really the backbone of this deck, is Direful Doll Providencia, it's a complicated name. The grade 2 Direful Doll. Now this is next to Liberata and one of the cards we're going to talk about in the grade 1 slot, the most important card in your deck for a couple of reasons. The first is when she attacks, this is one of the only times that is restricted to your opponent at being at grade 3. When he attacks a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, so long as you are on a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Direful Doll in its name, she gets 10,000 power. So just like Liberata, she's getting a 10k boost on attack, so long as you and your opponent are both at grade 3, making her a 20k beater by herself, which is great. We love those numbers. But what's really important is her second skill, which is at the end of the battle that she attacked, so long as you are on a grade 3 or greater Direful Doll, not restricted to your opponent being a grade 3, just you being a grade 3, you can Energy Blast 3, bind herself, so putting herself in the bind zone for later, and you get to take a card with a different card name from herself from your soul, call to rear guard. So this is your multi-attack extender. This is how you get 4 to 5 attacks in a turn, is having 1 to 2 copies of her in the front row, swinging with her, Energy Blasting 3, binding herself and calling something else, usually Liberata, from the soul out to attack again. So really good card. This is your main aggression piece in the deck, also with the fact that she gets 10,000 power just for existing when she attacks and creating more multi-attacks. And like I said, she is binding herself and putting herself in the bind zone for Android to call her out to guard with, and she becomes a 10k shield since she has 5k inherently. So that's really good. Amazing card, another one that you're running for until the end of time. Next, we are actually running 3 additional copies of the Ride line Grade 2 Griselda, and that's because of what her second skill does, which is very important, which is when she's placed on rear guard, you take a card with Direful Doll in its name from your hand, and you put it into the soul. You get to draw a card, and both her and the Vanguard get 5,000 power. So this is a good way of powering up Android and making him annoying numbers, making him 28, 38 on personal right turns. 33 and 43 if you call 2 of these down. So that's really nice. She puffs herself up. But what she's really doing is she's another way of just getting Direful Dolls that just are clogging up your hand that you really want in soul into your soul for later. So if you need to set up before using Android skill, you can throw her down to put Direful Dolls that are in your hand into your soul. If you have pieces that you want to make sure get called out during the attack phase by Griselda, or Providencia, excuse me, you have like a Liberata in your hand, you can call her down, put Liberata into your hand, so on and so forth. A lot of utility there of just fixing your soul if there are things that you have in your hand that you want in the soul. So that's why we run 3 more copies of her, just to maximize that consistency. And then lastly, we are actually running 3 of the Energy Cycler, one of the only non-Direful Dolls in this deck. This is kind of personal preference. If you would rather run Laminia, the Soul Blast 1 Cycler, for 1 discarded for ride line, Soul Blast 1, bot deck and draw, you can in this slot. I know some people do. It really kind of depends on your playstyle and what you want to do. I run the Energy Cycler because this deck, despite being very soul focused and having lots of ways of putting things into soul, actually can run out of soul if you're not careful and if you just kind of brick and don't see your main pieces. So I prefer this just to mitigate that risk and not so blasting with Laminia. And then also just because the only energy that you use in this deck is Providentia, which obviously you want to potentially do 5 attacks at a later point, and this can make that a little bit trickier because it's also Energy Blast. But again, sometimes you just don't see Providentia, or you see 1 Providentia and you're getting a bunch of energy anyway, and this can help with that. Plus, you want to try and draw a little bit in the early game. The early game is your weakest part of the game, so you really do want to run either this or Laminia. Again, just up to you and what you would prefer. I prefer the Energy Cycler, but if you want to run Laminia, go for it. On to the grade 1s. First and foremost, the third part of the Holy Trinity of this deck, one of the best cards next to Providentia and Liberata, is Direful Doll Pergela. I don't know these names. The grade 1. The reason why this is the third part of the Trinity here is her first skill, which is at the end of the battle that she boosted, if you have a Vanguard with Direful Doll in its name, you bind this unit, so another one just putting itself right into soul, or putting itself right into bind zone, to be guarded with later. You choose up to 2 Direful Dolls from your drop zone, put them into your soul. So this is your main way of recycling your pieces next to Liberata, of being able to take those things that you guard with that are in the drop zone, put them back into your soul to be able to call out later with either Providentia or Android. So huge. This is what just makes the deck work because it's putting 2 back every time you bind the skill. So having 2 out is great. You're putting 4 Direful Dolls from your drop zone into your soul. It allows just so much utility for whatever situation you're in or what piece that you're missing that you need back. This just helps fix all that. But then on top of that, it also just has a really great second skill, which is so long as you have a Vanguard with Direful Doll in its name, this gets a continuous just plus 5k shield. So this is great when combined with Android's guard skill, where he's also giving this 5k shield when guarded within the bind zone, making this a 15k shield. And his biggest shield is a trigger, which is huge. Great for guarding, great for staying alive and blocking bigger attacks, because this is a 15k shield, which we love that. But then also, even outside the using to guard during the bind, from the bind zone with Android, this is just a 10k shield, because that 5k shield for her is not restricted to being used from the bind zone. This just gets plus 5k shield for existing at any time, so long as you have a Direful Doll Vanguard. So that's great. 10k shield regardless, 15k shield with Android. Great take card. The other card of this deck that you're just never cutting at any point. And continuing with the grade 1s, we're running max copies of the grade 1 in the ride line as well, partially because we're struggling for Direful Dolls. There aren't a whole lot of Direful Dolls before Fated Clash that are actually usable. Most of them are complete trash or don't work at all with this deck, so we got to use what we have for now, which is the grade 1 Loretta, and that's because the second skill is still interesting and decent for the deck. What it is that when this attacks or boosts, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Direful Doll in its name, till the end of the battle, this unit gets 5,000 power, and then at the end of the battle, you guessed it, it binds itself. So good, just a little power gain. It's a 13k beater or booster that adds itself to the bind zone that you can call out with Android to be a 10k shield since it has 5k inherently. So pretty good. We love 13k beaters and boosters, but there are cards coming out in set 2 that will certainly be cutting into the slot. So rest assured, it's not staying at max 3 of, but for right now, it works just fine, just as a good beater and booster. And then something a little spicy tech that I'm doing that I don't see a lot of people doing is actually 2 copies of Direful Doll Simone. This is an OG set 1 for Overdress, the Genesis the 5 Great set. I think that's what it was called. Original Overdress set. And this card has an interesting effect, which is when this unit boosts, if you have 5 or more cards in your soul, you counterblast 1 until the end of that battle. Your opponent cannot guard from hand unless they call 2 or more to guard. So as long as you have 5 or more cards in your soul, it's a battle lore effect. Your opponent has to call 2 or more to guard. I like this a lot with Simone. I like this a lot with Android because of his triple drive. That means that a lot of the time people are going to just try and perfect guard him because they don't want to waste the triple drive. And so this makes it hard to do that because this requires them to then drop an extra card on top of the perfect guard and just eat more cards out of their hand. That's the one thing this deck really struggles with is offensive pressure, since Providentia is the only thing giving you any multi-attack extension. And so this helps just kind of eat more cards out of their hand on the offense, which you really need to try and do. So I like 2 copies of this. Whether or not she'll stick around is a better question, but for now I like the 2 of. And we are running 2 copies, actually, of the Almajuster Grade 1. She's back. We talked about her before in the Unica deck profile, and she's here now, which might raise some eyebrows if you don't know the synergy here. But for anyone who doesn't know, we're running here for a second skill, which is if your opponent's Vanguard is at grade 3 or greater, you bind a trigger out of your soul, and this unit gets 10,000 power. Now, why would we do that? And why are there triggers in your soul? The reason, spoiler alert for the trigger section, there are triggers that we are running that happen to actually have the Direful Doll name in them, which means that Android can call them out of the bind zone to guard and give them 5k shield. So suddenly any 15k triggers are now 20k triggers, any 20k triggers are now 25k triggers, and so on. So this allows you to put triggers are just high shield cards in your bind zone for Android to utilize. So that's why I run this. I know some people run more than 2 copies, but I found that they just sometimes it's just hard to set up, and you maybe just don't see a lot of triggers. And you do have some triggers that aren't Direful Dolls, just by the nature of we don't have a lot of them. So you might have this and just not have seen a single Direful Doll trigger, in which case this is a dead card. So I prefer only 2 copies. It still comes up now and then, but at least right now when we don't have a lot of triggers that are Direful Dolls, and it's harder to actually set those up in the soul, I prefer only the 2 copies, not to just, so we don't really cramping on the space for the Direful Doll units. So 2 copies. And then lastly, for the non-sentinels, I am actually running 2 kitty cats. Kitty cats here mainly for the counter charge. So Direful Dolls is a very tanky deck. We've not established that at this point. So games tend to go long. And you are counterblasting at least 1 every turn, ideally 2 for Laborata or for Simone. So eventually you are going to burn through your counterblasts, especially if the games are going 3, 4, 5, 6 turns in. So you want to make sure you see the cat, because the cat allows you to countercharge and keep going. For anyone who doesn't know, this is one of those generic cats that says when it's placed on the rear guard or guardian circle, take 2 cards from your ride line from the solar drop, put them back into the ride line face up, and in his case, if put on the rear guard, countercharge. If placed on the guardian circle, he's a 20k shield. So we like it for that too. Anything that gives you a 20k shield or just bigger shield in this meta, great, fantastic. Good thing to run. So we run 2 just to make sure you see the countercharge though. And this is one of those where the countercharge is actually the more important reason why we're running it over the 20k shield. So I recommend at least 1 of these. I prefer 2 just to make sure you see it. And lastly, good old 3 Nation Perfect Guards, 1 Sanctitude. I've said this a million times, and I'll say it again. The Nation Perfect Guards allow you to ignore the discard cost for Perfect Guarding if you have 1 or less cards in hand, and Sanctitude ignores the discard costs for Perfect Guarding if your opponent has the text triple drive. Thankfully, Android doesn't. So this does not get around Android. And then also, though, if there are any guard restricts that you're facing, like Simone, this can be placed without having to place another card from your hand at the same time, because this is going to the order zone, not the guardian circle. So it gets around all those garbage tricks. Triggers. So we already talked about it a little bit, but we are doing 8 crits, and the most important crit is this one. The Direful Doll Bethany is underneath. Bethany. Direful Doll Bethany crit. You can run whatever you want for this crit. Does not matter. The go to soul crit is fine. The emergency soul charge is kind of important in this deck. This is the crit that matters. You need to run this crit because it has the Direful Doll name, and you can put this into the soul for your Almagestor grade 1 to bind and then guard with, and this becomes a 20k shield. So I do not care what you do with these 4 crits, but these 4 crits need to be Bethany. Then for our 3 of extra trigger, we are doing fronts. You do not need draws in this deck. You are tanky enough without the extra cards in your hand, and you will generally just, like I said, build up a lot of hand because you're both not really guarding from hand a lot, and you are not calling from hand to your rear guard circle a lot. And plus you need more offensive pressure, which is this deck really lacks. So we run the fronts for that to give an extra 10k to your front row, a little bit more power, a little bit more push on those turns. So 3 front triggers. If there's a Direful Doll front, we'd run it, but there isn't. So regular effect fronts. Where there are more Direful Dolls, though, is the heal lineup. So Direful Doll Alexandria and Direful Doll Charmaine are your other Direful Doll triggers. If you want to do a 2-2 split, this is the grade heal, the one that says if your opponent's at a grade higher than you, it gets plus 5k shield, so it's 20k shield. You can. I think it really depends on the meta. We're just starting to cycle out of the Stride meta and really get into, Varga, Raziel, those decks. So I kind of like going back to just the generic heals for just the pure 15k shields whenever, but still having one grade heal that you could just cycle in and out of your soul with all of the cards that put cards from your drop zone back into the soul, and then bind it with Almagestor if you are against a Stride deck, and this becomes a 25k shield against Stride decks, so we love that. But again, if you want to do a 2-2 split of these, sure. Just make sure it needs to be these heals because of the name of the main Direful Dolls. Just keep that in mind. OTs. There's no Direful Doll OTs, unfortunately, and I'm actually running the Dark States OT, which may confuse some of you, being like, well, Cody, you talked about how you only won the Dark States OT, and Dark States deck with the restanding Vanguard Android doesn't restand, which you're correct. This does not restand. But the reason we're running this OT over, say, the blue overtrigger, is because, one, the blue overtrigger ability to take cards from your drop zone and back into your hand is kind of counterintuitive. You want most of your cards to stay in the drop zone because you want to put them from your drop zone directly into the soul. So that part's not super useful. And then the crit that it gives is nice, but it's only for that turn. Whereas this crit, while it only goes to the Vanguard, lasts for the rest of the game. And as we've talked about, the main thing this deck struggles with is offensive pressure. So one way we can help with offensive pressure is to make it so that our Vanguard always has a crit for the rest of the game. And every turn the Vanguard swings, not only does he have triple drive, not only is he probably getting 5k from something like Griselda, but he's got an extra 10k in a crit. So now if they weren't going to perfect guard him before, because even if he had triple drive, now they're definitely trying to perfect guard every single time because he has the extra crit, which then leads into why we're running Simone, because Simone then makes so they have to call 2 cards to guard. So yeah, it's mainly for the offensive pressure. If they're, I've seen the blue or the purple and the yellow OT coming out in Festival Collection. Yeah, I don't love either of those in this deck. Either the yellow OT will just make you deck out, and the purple OT, yeah, the heal's nice, but that's not doing a whole lot for you on the call from hand front because your board's always going to be full. So yeah, probably still just sticking with this because, again, you just really want offensive pressure, and this is the best kind of offensive pressure you're going to consistently get for the rest of the game is why we're running it. So I like the Dark States OT. If I was going to run anything else, it'd be blue. For the crit that it gives, so at least you're running 9 crit. But I want the crit that's going to last for the rest of the fight, even if it's only on the Vanguard. And yeah, that is Direful Dolls. This deck is really fun. You understand once you play it that it's got this really good synergy between those three cards that we talked about: Liberator, Providentia, and Pagelia. Of just calling cards out of your soul, binding them, guarding with them, putting from your drop zone back into soul, rinse and repeat. It feels really good to play. It just synergizes with itself so well and just makes it a lot of fun. And as someone who played Palemoon back in the day, having something like that again just is really enticing. I like that play style a lot. The like combo heavy play style is just really fun. So I'm enjoying this deck a lot. And I hope we continue to get consistent support and more Direful Dolls to make this deck more interesting. We got a couple coming in set 2, both of which I think are pretty good. Nothing crazy, unfortunately, but they're pretty good. And you're certainly running them. I just hope that continues on through set 4 and beyond, and this deck continues to be something that you can play and feel good in the meta playing it. Yeah, this is what I got for you guys for Direful Dolls. Obviously, as always, if you have questions or want to talk through anything, definitely say so in the comments, and you'll hear from us again soon. Thanks. Bye.